What does time have to do with the garden home? Well, stick around and I'll show you. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to the Garden Home, where you'll find practical ideas, beautiful landscapes, and much more to help inspire you to push the boundaries of your home right out into the garden, taking advantage of all of your living space. Now in today's show, we're going to talk about time. Now I know this idea of time may seem a little abstract, but hopefully by the end of the show, we'll see the role time plays in a little different way. Now when I create a garden home, and like I said, that's an extension of your living space outdoors, I do this with a series of garden rooms. Let's take a look at some of the garden rooms that surround my home. This is my rondelle or circle garden. As you can see, it comes directly off my loggia or covered breezeway that connects the garage to the house. Now notice that the rondelle is contained by these boxwood hedges, and in keeping with the room-like feeling, there's even a garden gate serving as a door. When you combine a series of garden rooms, like my rondelle garden, then you begin to utilize every inch of your property, thereby extending your living space. Now let's move on to the front garden, which takes the shape of a long rectangle, and it's filled with all sorts of things, from shrubs to old-fashioned roses, perennials, annuals, and even bulbs. The front garden then leads us into the fountain garden. Now remember, the element of time is what we're focusing on in today's show. Here's what this fountain garden looked like roughly 10 years ago. Quite a transformation, don't you think? Today, it's a beautiful garden enclosed with a needlepoint holly hedge. Now, a tour of my garden wouldn't be complete without a visit to the vegetable garden with its ever-changing palette of good things to eat. Here I enjoy growing lettuce and broccoli in the spring, squash and tomatoes in summer, and peppers in the fall, and always in combination with lots of colorful annual flowers. You know, when I look at images of my garden, I'm always astonished. You see, because when I started, it was just a blank slate. It was literally a gravel lot. And in 10 years, well, the change has been dramatic. When I think of change in my garden, I tend to think of the fall, because during this time of year, I'm putting to bed last season's garden and looking forward to next year's. I always like to try to include a plant or two in the garden that reflects all the seasons, trees in particular. My crab apples are one of the best examples, and every season I can depend on something glorious from them. In the spring, they're a beautiful snowstorm of white blossoms. The summer finds them with green leaves that are kissed by the sun. And as summer turns to fall, the green leaves become bright yellow, and the tiny little crab apples begin to show up. The birds clamor for these treats as the golden leaves begin to drop in winter. I enjoy the way the tree branches become architectural elements in the garden against the gray skies of winter. Now there are other trees that can give the same sort of delight in every season, such as crepe myrtle, hawthorn, and Japanese maples. Of course, no one understands this idea of changing seasons better than farmers. They're always trying to get ahead of Mother Nature. And the same is the case with me in my own garden. You see, I'm also trying to plan ahead from one season to the next. In the fall, I plant lots of bulbs in anticipation of spring. I also move plants around the garden. It's a great time for me to reevaluate the design of the garden. So if there are shrubs that need to be transplanted, then I can do that in the fall. They settle in nicely and pick back up in the spring. Now let's get back to this idea of bulbs. What's fascinating to me about these spring flowering bulbs, such as daffodils and others, is that the flower itself is packaged just inside the bulb. And all you have to do is take a knife and split it down the center, through the middle like that, and open it up. Let's see here. And you can actually see the baby flower there. Now, our job is to plant these bulbs in just the right place and in just the correct way such that we coax that flower out. Now the marvelous thing about daffodils, if you get them planted correctly, they can be in your garden for years to come. That's exactly the case here on this farm that I frequent. It belongs to friends of mine, and each fall we plant daffodils for beautiful blooms next spring. What I like to do is plant a single variety in a large drift of, say, 15 to 20 bulbs. Gives you the most visual impact. Daffodils will grow in average soil as long as it's well drained. For nourishment, I work in plenty of compost and some bone meal since they're going to be there for a while. Now when it comes to depth of planting, I just go by a very simple rule of thumb, which is to cover the bulbs about 3 times the height of the bulb itself, so I can overplant with annuals in the spring. If you live in a mild climate, you might try overplanting them with pansies in the fall for bloom all winter long. You see, daffodils are outstanding perennial bulbs, and this means you should plant them in an area where they won't be disturbed when planting other plants later in the season. One last tip about daffodils. You can have a long season of bloom by planting 3 different types. One that blooms early, others that bloom in mid-season, and daffodils that are late bloomers. Some of my favorite early bloomers are ice follies. And for a mid-season bloomer, Salome has always been a great performer in my garden. And for late blooming daffodils, well, I love the old-fashioned pheasant eye. It brings the daffodil season to a close in my garden. So in the fall, I plan ahead for the spring. In the winter, I work on my design ideas and evaluate what worked and what didn't work during the growing season. When spring rolls around, I take a look at the garden and begin to think about ways to bring color into my garden all the way up till frost. And in summer, well, during summer I'm just trying to keep up. That's why the element of time is also about saving time in the garden. Planting with North American natives is a great way to bring time-saving color into your garden from summer to fall. When those long, hot dog days of summer roll in, I find myself looking for a shady spot and a glass of lemonade. And my garden, by this time of year, is looking for another splash of color. Well, you know, there's no better place to look than to the North American native plants. Like this Joe Pyeweed. Just look at this incredible color. I just love its dusty mauve hues. Now this plant is so easy to grow. It's a perennial. It'll come back in your garden year after year. And you better make sure you have plenty of room because it can grow to great heights, 5 to 6 feet. Another late season showstopper is summer phlox. Now there's so many different cultivars and hybrids available, but the original stock is actually from native plants, gathered from the wild. And then of course there's the purple coneflower, echinacea, just finishing up this time of year, but nonetheless spectacular. And just look at this exuberant display of black-eyed Susans or Rudbeckia. It just seems like the more you turn up the heat, the better they perform. These showy flowers are particularly suited as companions to many of the native grasses, which move so gracefully in the wind. As the late summer performers fade, the show still isn't over. We have the fall bloomers to look forward to. Soon they'll be taking the stage. Plants such as solidago or goldenrod, asters, and ageratum or blue mist flower will dazzle us. As you've just seen, there's so many outstanding plants you can draw from that are actually native North American species. What I like about them is that they're tough and reliable performers. Now I want to take just a moment and touch on another element of design, and that's structure. You see, in my vegetable garden, the structure of the raised beds, the rustic trellis, the tool shed, and even the structure that this boxwood hedge provides all contributes to the framework of this garden. Another time, space and money-saving trick I've learned is to train climbing plants on twig teepees that are easily made from small tree limbs that I've saved from pruning projects earlier in the year. I start with 3 sturdy, upright branches. Now the length can vary based on how they're going to be used, but allow at least 6 to 8 inches to be pushed into the ground. To assemble one of these, just gather them at the top and bind them with a piece of copper wire. I just connect the supporting poles with 3 lengths of wood, about 18 inches from the ground, by wrapping the copper wire in a crisscross pattern. In the container, I've planted Clematis Comtesse de Bouchard. It's a fancy French name, but let me tell you, she's really easy to grow. And I've also planted golden hops along with her. I think the rustic look of the twig teepee really speaks to the element of time in that these plants grow very fast and can give a mature look in a very short length of time. Other fast growers you might consider training on a trellis like this are morning glories, moonflower vines, cypress vine, and even the hyacinth bean vine, which I grow up my rustic trellises in the back of my vegetable garden. Another time-saving technique for the garden is all about the design of the garden and its framework. You see, if you start with a good framework, then you don't have to replant year after year. In my front garden, I've created a backdrop with an evergreen hedge, and I've filled in with beds of roses, shrubs, trees, perennials, ornamental grasses, and lots of annuals. I like to use annuals like Cosmos, Coleus, Impatience, and that little Duchess Terrenia, or the wishbone flower. It does great in full sun. Now, I just can't emphasize this idea of having a good framework in place enough. You see, good bones, well, that's really what the garden is all about. You want to make sure you keep a good balance between your shrubs and trees and perennials and annuals. Don't let just one of them dominate. Now, another way to save time in the garden is through planting with containers. We all live busy lives and don't have a lot of time, but container planting can give your garden that certain little sparkle. They're easy to put together. Let me give you a recipe for success. The recipe is simply this: something tall and spiky in the back or center of the container, plants that become round and full, placed in the middle, and something to cascade down the front or the edges. In this container, the tall and spiky element is a white cardoon. Just look at its frosty leaves. Now, while considered part of the artichoke family, I grow cardoons strictly as ornamentals for their strong architectural foliage. For round and full elements, I used white Gara whirling butterflies and Argyranthemum comet pink. Now let's look at these plants individually. You see, Gara is a great summer plant because it can take hot and even drought-like conditions. Argyranthemum is a summer annual that blooms consistently from spring through the mid to late summer, even in the hottest areas. The cascading plants are the finishing touches to the composition. Here I've used Verbena lanai bright pink and Helichrysum dwarf silver. Just look at how beautifully they spill from the container. Verbena is another great colorful annual, and it really adds a splash to both containers and flower borders. And I always consider using a bit of gray foliage. Gray foliage just seems to get along with everyone. Time certainly has an effect on the appearance of objects in the garden. I think it's interesting how even the slightest patina of age on an object can make it feel more harmonious or comfortable in a garden setting, knocking off that shiny new brashness. Now, if you have a container in your garden that feels too new, there's an easy way to sort of tone it down and make it fit in just a little better. That's by grunging it. It's a simple process. Let me show you what's involved. Just make a solution of 50-50 water-soluble paint and water. Then just slop it on with a brush. When it comes to the color, the grungier the hue, the better. I like to use gray greens or taupes. You may even want to use two slightly contrasting colors. And then before it dries, wipe off the excess paint with a damp sponge or rag, but leave it down in the cracks. Next, give it a natural touch by using the juice of weeds, which will enhance the color and give the concrete that aged look. Just rub the weeds or grass over the container, allowing the sap or juice to soak in. The old method for aging concrete is blending sheep manure and buttermilk, but that takes a strong stomach and a lot more time. So why bother when you can get these results with a can of paint and some weeds? The element of time and aged objects certainly goes hand in hand. When you plant a garden, you should also consider the style of the architecture on the property. Let me show you what I mean. Some friends of mine built this beautiful New England salt box style house in the middle of the country. While the home is relatively new, it's the attention to detail that makes it look and feel so convincingly old. And it's the same attention to detail that can be found in the garden, both in terms of its plants and garden elements. All speak to the spirit of a former time. When people come to your house for the first time, are they surprised to find a New England salt box in the South?
Yes, yes they are.
Tell me a little bit about the architecture of the house.
Well, this is a New England salt box of the 1730s, 40s, along in there. I just like the style. I saw it in a lot of pictures in magazines and books.
And always wanted a house like this?
Always wanted a house like this.
And built one.
Right. I love the simplicity of the salt box. And just love the way it looks.
The garden that you've created to go along with it works beautifully with the architecture.
Right. I started out just planting plants that would have grown in New England back in that period of the house, but I found that much too limiting, so...
Restricted your creativity.
Right. Well, there are too many beautiful flowers in Arkansas to limit yourself to those.
There are too many beautiful flowers to choose from, particularly these days with all the new cultivars and the availability of a wide range of plants.
That's right.
I love the way you have annuals coming up accidentally through all of your perennials.
Right.
It's a great effect.
Things just kind of reseed here.
Yeah,
and
serendipitously.
I like it. Right.
Nancy, the overall effect of the house and garden really feels harmonious. I mean, what you've done here is marvelous. I think this handsome house is such a beautiful backdrop for the garden.
Well, thank you, Alan.
I find that whenever I have a house or a fence or a hedge, some dark background, the flowers seem to jump out and they show off better.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Even before I even went to New England, I love this style house.
Well, the cottage garden that you've created here as a part of the house, it really feels right.
Well, good, good.
Now here's an interesting story involving the element of time in the garden. I was visiting Charleston, South Carolina, when I met a couple who live on the site of a Revolutionary War campground. Price and Louisa Cameron are not only avid gardeners, but Louisa is the author of books showcasing the history and design of local gardens. The brick that you've used to create this, they look ancient.
They are old, and we dug them up ourselves from underneath this section of what is now lawn. There used to be a 70-foot brick outbuilding here, and this was the patio or paved area in front of it.
I see.
And you won't believe what else we dug up in this garden. We've dug up bricks and all sorts of artifacts, which I'd like to show you.
Wonderful. A bit of archaeology here in the garden.
Oh, and it's so much fun. I'm still finding things.
Louisa, I was only expecting a few things. I mean, this is amazing. All of this came out of the garden?
All of it, and I have buckets more.
Oh, my heavens. Look at this. Look at that. Looks like a coin.
It is. It's a George II coin. I took it to a coin expert.
Well, that certainly dates the house, doesn't it?
It does.
And what is this?
That is the escutcheon from a soldier's cartridge box.
I see, right. To
British
wear
soldier.
over here on the belt. Amazing. And look at all these shards of pottery.
This we found in the ceiling when they removed the old plaster. It's a bottle that says Corn Pane on one side and East India on the other. We found a lot of bottles.
Look at this looks like a doll of some sort or a little statue.
She's wearing a Liberty cap, and I think it was a doll baby.
How interesting.
And this one I found about 3 or 4 weeks ago, just when I was sweeping up. It's another doll, China doll with a bonnet on.
So you find these objects frequently when you're working in the garden?
I found this one just last month.
How amazing. So bit by bit, the garden reveals her secrets.
It does. This is a cane handle.
Look at that. Feels like lead.
And an 18th century pipe that came right out of the garden. A toothbrush.
Look at that. Without its bristles.
Yes, of course.
Louisa, these objects would represent what sort of time span?
About 225 or 30 years.
Working hand in hand with the element of time is mystery. Those artifacts certainly incite curiosity in me. I wonder who they belong to and why they were left behind. Another way the Camerons created mystery in their garden is by leaving a surprise for the visitor to find as they tour the garden. They did this by creating a curved path so that the view around the corner isn't revealed until it's time. Louisa gives us a tour of the garden. Of course, the house was designed in the 18th century, but how much of the garden reflects that period, Louisa?
Well, the garden has some elements of 18th century design in it, but my husband designed it and is still working on the design of it. He designed it about 20 years ago.
Really? And the process just continues?
Yes.
Isn't it fun?
It's so much fun.
The thing that strikes me about this bed, the way you have it planted now, is that you've allowed serendipity to enter into the garden with these wonderful larkspur coming up everywhere.
Well, you have to, and you should have seen what Hugo blew in. There were all sorts of strange weeds and flowers.
Really?
And plants.
Yeah. Foreign visitors.
Lots of
brought
them.
in by the storm. Now tell me a little bit about some of the shrubs that you've planted along here, Louisa, to create this effect.
Well, the red-leafed ones, which will green up later in the season, are Loropetalum rubrum.
Right, the Chinese witch hazel.
Is that what it is?
Yes, that's a common name for it.
And then viburnum on either side of the magnolia. The vine on the wall is Ficus pumila and has to be clipped constantly. We lost some trees in here, and so we're training various vines such as Confederate jasmine along the wall.
Yeah, I really like the way you've trained these vines along the wall. You've created a beautiful tapestry of bloom and leaf.
Thank you. We've tried very hard to do that.
The loose planting of these shrubs and the rhythm that they create is a beautiful contrast to the formality of the parterres.
Yes, I'm glad you picked up on that.
Yeah, it's a nice juxtaposition. And look at what we have here. My goodness, look what a beautiful lettuce border.
Thank you. It's my only successful crop.
Oh my gosh, look at this. You've got quite a variety. Butter Crunch, Red Sail. This is Black-Seeded Simpson. Beautiful. You know, I've got a border of lettuce planted in my garden, and I've got some of the ornamental onions coming up in it, but I haven't thought about the larkspur. That's a really handsome combination.
Well, thanks, and I haven't thought about the onions. I'll have to try that. We pick a salad every night.
Oh, isn't it great? Yeah. I've mixed some little violas in with mine, and I'll actually eat the flowers of the viola as well.
Oh, pretty.
Yeah, it makes a nice salad. It's just so much fun to mix things up and experiment.
Oh, I do a lot of that. I have pass-along plants. I have plants from my Garden Club Exchange, plants from Walmart and Kmart without labels.
Right. Mine is much the same. Now, this is really a handsome structure.
Structure's the right word.
So the idea here is to grow this Japanese yew within this framework and use it as a guide for the clipping.
Yes, it's called a tutor, the guide. It's
Right.
literally a tutor.
The tutor that helps support it. I've had some similar made in my garden to support my roses.
These were made by a local iron worker, but you can buy similar structures pre-assembled at your local garden centers.
Yes, they make a wonderful vertical and architectural element in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, look at this over here. What a wonderful surprise.
This is our secret garden.
It is indeed. I love it. It's really beautiful the way you look over the holly fern and see that small pond with the cast iron plant as a backdrop.
Thank you. We enjoy the pond and we enjoy the goldfish in the pond.
Now, is that your potting shed beyond?
It is. We keep the lawnmower in there too.
You know, this is a good example of how even in a small garden, you can accentuate that sense of expansiveness by putting an object at the back and then layering different objects in the foreground. It's really marvelous.
Thank you. I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're right.
What a wonderful view of the back of the house.
It's my favorite view.
Look at those church steeples. Now, this is one of the best examples of a borrowed view that I can imagine. It's really fantastic.
I'm grateful for it.
I discovered my own bit of mystery in my garden when I was laying it out and preparing the beds. I uncovered this old carriage block. And although it really hasn't found a new home in the design of the garden, I can't bear to part with it, considering it's been a part of this property for much longer than I have. Now, another way that I've established a sense of mystery in my garden is with a simple picket fence. You see, this fence surrounds most of my garden and is accented with old-fashioned roses, this marvelous spring-blooming snowball viburnum, and even tall holly hedges. The fence and these companion plantings never allow you to get a full view, so you find yourself peering over the fence to catch a glimpse of what's on the other side. In today's show, we've seen how time influences every aspect of the garden, just as it does our own lives. I hope you can take away some of these ideas that'll help make your garden home more beautiful and enjoyable. From the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Alan Smith's Garden Home.
Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Get swept away with color, and I don't mean with just blooms. See how these vivid foliage plants can play a role in your garden home. We'll also look at ways to bring the cottage style of gardening to any size home. You won't want to miss it.